Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow stroll back in time, not to the grand castles or the epic battlefields, but to a place far more intimate, far more aromatic. Picture it. You're trudging along a muddy, rutted track, the kind that squelches beneath your worn leather boots with every step. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and something vaguely unwashed, bites with a chill that sneaks right past your threadbare wool tunic. Up ahead, through the gloom of a perpetual twilight, a flicker of warm light dances, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. And then you hear it, a low, rumbling murmur, punctuated by bursts of raucous laughter and the clinking of tankards. That, my friends, is the unmistakable soundtrack of a medieval tavern. You're heading towards it, drawn by the promise of warmth, a bite to eat, and perhaps a reprieve from the endless, back-breaking toil of medieval life. Gosh. Just imagine for a moment, stepping out of your modern, climate-controlled comfort and into that world. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone a night, without a serious case of the medieval sniffles, or worse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop a comment below with where you are and what time it is for you right now. It's always cool to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Push open a heavy creaking wooden door, and a wave of sound and sensation washes over you. The air inside is a thick, soupy mix of wood smoke, stale ale, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely meaty simmering over an open fire. Your eyes, accustomed to the dim twilight outside, struggle to adjust to the flickering candlelight and the ruddy glow from the central hearth. It's a cacophony. Loud, booming voices, the clatter of earthenware mugs, the occasional burst of song, off-key and enthusiastic. This isn't the sanitized theme park version of a medieval establishment. This is the real deal, raw and unfiltered. Your nostrils flare, trying to process the assault of smells. You can almost taste the lingering scent of unwashed patrons, a hint of something fermenting, and the ever-present aroma of damp wool. The floor beneath your feet, you quickly discover, isn't quite level. Uneven flagstones and packed earth making for a tricky walk. You notice immediately that there's no hush, no polite murmur. Everyone seems to be speaking at once, their voices competing to be heard over the general din. It's a sensory overload, the kind that makes your modern sensibilities perk up and wonder if you've made a terrible mistake. But there's also an undeniable pull, a raw vitality to the place. This is where stories are told, deals are struck, and worries are, for a brief time, forgotten. Historians still argue whether the perceived dirtiness of medieval taverns was truly as extreme as later accounts suggest, or if it's simply a modern projection of hygiene standards. Either way, you probably wouldn't want to lick the floor. As your eyes adjust, you start to make out the details of this medieval watering hole. The walls are rough-hewn timber, darkened by centuries of smoke and grime. A few crudely drawn images, perhaps a saint or a legendary beast, are barely visible beneath layers of soot. The ceiling is low, crisscrossed with heavy wooden beams, and it feels as though the entire structure might groan and settle with every boisterous laugh. You notice a large, open hearth dominating one wall, where a fire crackles merrily, providing the primary source of light and warmth. Around it, a few figures huddle, drying damp clothes, or simply enjoying the radiating heat. It's a stark reminder that central heating is still many, many centuries away. This particular establishment, though perhaps a little rough around the edges, is fairly typical of what you'd encounter. The term tavern itself actually has ancient roots, stretching all the way back to Roman times. The Romans had their tabernae, which were often small shops or stalls, sometimes serving food and wine, acting as predecessors to the later inns and pubs we know. As the Roman Empire faded, the concept of a public place to eat, drink, and socialize didn't disappear. It simply evolved. In medieval Europe, the tavern became a vital institution, especially for travelers and the working classes. They weren't just places to get a drink. They were community centers, places for news to be exchanged, deals to be struck, and disputes to be settled, often with more ale than wisdom, if we're honest. Imagine for a moment that you're a weary merchant, having traveled for days on treacherous roads, or a local farmer, bone-tired from the fields. The tavern would be your haven, your temporary escape. There were few other public spaces for common folk to gather. Churches, yes, but those were for spiritual solace, not for swapping bawdy jokes or discussing the price of wool. The Lord's Manor was off limits unless you were summoned. So the tavern filled a crucial void in the social fabric of the time. It was a place where, for a few hours, the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism might loosen its grip a tiny bit. A peasant might share a bench with a craftsman, or even a low-ranking knight, though you'd still expect a certain deference, of course. The sheer omnipresence of taverns is quite striking when you look at historical records. In some towns, it felt like there was a tavern on every corner, each competing for the custom of thirsty locals and passing strangers. They were economic drivers, too, providing employment for the alewife, her servers, and often a stable boy or two. They also offered a ready market for local farmers who supplied the grain for the ale, and the ingredients for the simple meals. You're probably thinking, wow, sounds like medieval Yelp reviews would be brutal, and you'd be right. Competition meant some taverns were cleaner, their ales stronger, their food more palatable. Others, well, let's just say they catered to a less discerning palate. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly preferred weaker, small beer for daily consumption, or if that was merely the practical reality of brewing technology and available resources. It's hard to imagine being excited about watery beer, but when water wasn't always safe to drink, even weak ale was a safer bet. Plus, a little buzz probably took the edge off a lot of medieval realities. You take another step, venturing deeper into the common room, and immediately realize that personal space isn't really a medieval concept. You find yourself jostling shoulders with a burly farmer whose tunic smells faintly of manure and honest sweat, and nearly trip over a sleeping dog curled up by the hearth. The floor, as you suspected, is a mix of packed earth and uneven flagstones, probably liberally seasoned with spilled ale and whatever else has dropped from the tables over the course of the day. You try not to think too hard about the whatever else. The room itself is a chaotic masterpiece of communal living. Long, sturdy wooden tables and benches are arranged haphazardly, already packed with patrons. There are no individual tables for intimate conversations here. Everything is shared. You're expected to squeeze in wherever there's an inch of space, perhaps even sharing a bench with complete strangers. It's a bit like a medieval, very loud and slightly sticky cafeteria. The air hangs heavy with smoke, not just from the hearth, but from pipes. If tobacco has made its way across the Atlantic yet, which it probably hasn't in most of the medieval period we're imagining, then perhaps other herbal smokes. More likely it's just the pervasive wood smoke from the cooking and heating fire, stinging your eyes slightly. The lighting is abysmal by modern standards. Beyond the roaring hearth, most illumination comes from a few sputtering candles, or perhaps a rudimentary oil lamp hanging precariously from a beam. Shadows dance wildly across the faces of the patrons, making them seem even more mysterious and, frankly, a little menacing. You squint trying to discern faces in the gloom, but it's a losing battle. Everything is a blurred tableau of movement and sound. Can't help but notice the constant coming and going near the entrance, as new patrons brave the cold night and others, presumably very well hydrated, stumble out into the darkness. This common room is the beating heart of the tavern, the very reason it exists. It's where business is conducted, news is disseminated, and spirits are quite literally lifted. You might hear a peddler hawking his wares in one corner, his voice rising above the general din, while in another, a group of laborers argue heatedly over a game of dice. Over there, a lone traveler, cloaked and hooded, sips his ale quietly, perhaps hoping to blend into the shadows, or maybe just recovering from a long day's journey. It's a microcosm of medieval society, all crammed into one smoky, bustling space. The lack of privacy, which would drive most modern folks absolutely batty, was simply a fact of life. Most medieval homes were small and crowded, so the idea of sharing a space with many people was not at all unusual. In fact, it was probably comforting for many. A sense of belonging in a harsh and often lonely world. One mainstream historical fact to note is that ale was often safer to drink than water in many medieval towns, due to contamination. This led to its widespread consumption by all ages. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval taverns would have a branch or bush hanging outside their door as an unofficial sign. indicating they sold ale. Hence the phrase, good wine needs no bush. And finally, historians still argue whether the level of drunkenness in medieval taverns was generally higher or lower than modern public houses. Given the weaker alcohol content, but constant consumption, just know there'd be at least one person attempting to sing a very questionable ballad. As you finally wedge yourself onto a bench, perhaps sharing it with a portly merchant loudly complaining about the price of wool in a quiet, hooded figure nursing a suspiciously dark drink, you begin to truly observe the tapestry of medieval life around you. This isn't just a place for drinking, it's a social theater, a living snapshot of a bygone era. Every face tells a story, etched with the hardships and simple joys of their existence. Over by the hearth, a group of laborers, their hands gnarled and calloused from a lifetime of physical work, are engaged in a lively, somewhat slurred debate about the best way to plow a difficult field. Their clothes are simple, practical, probably hadn't seen a proper washing in weeks, giving off a distinct earthy aroma that somehow blends into the general atmosphere of the tavern. They speak in a local dialect, thick with regional accents, and their laughter is boisterous and uninhibited, the kind that comes from truly letting loose after a long, arduous day. You catch snippets of their conversation, complaints about the Lord's demands, hopes for a good harvest, and perhaps a juicy piece of local gossip about someone's pig escaping. Near the entrance, a few travelers huddle together, their cloaks still damp from the road. One might be a peddler, his pack resting beside him, ready to display his trinkets and notions at the next market town. Another could be a pilgrim, identifiable by a scallop shell on his hat, making his way to a holy shrine. They speak in hushed tones, perhaps exchanging news from distant lands, rumors of wars, or perhaps just comparing the quality of the roads they've endured. For these individuals, the tavern isn't just a stop, it's an essential part of their journey, a place to rest, resupply, and gather vital information before continuing on their way. And then there are the locals, the townsfolk who frequent this particular establishment. You spot a couple of journeymen, young apprentices perhaps. A bit too eager with their ale, their faces flushed with youthful exuberance. They're probably discussing their craft, boasting about their skills, and eyeing the few unattached women in the room. There might be a scribe or a minor clerk, distinguished by his slightly cleaner attire, and a more refined, though perhaps equally drunken, manner of speech, trying to impress someone with his meager literacy. And of course, the ever-present gossips, their heads close together, whispering conspiratorially about the latest scandal or misfortune to befall a neighbor. It's a bit like stepping into a medieval reality show, complete with all the drama and mundane details. The social dynamics are fascinating. You notice how different groups tend to congregate, yet the fluid nature of the common room means interactions are constant. A laugh from one table might prompt a jest from another. Someone might spontaneously break into song, and others might join in, however poorly. This shared experience forged a sense of community, even among strangers. Historians still argue whether medieval social classes truly blurred within the tavern setting, or if subtle markers and unspoken rules of deference always remained firmly in place. It's safe to say, however, that the ale had a democratizing effect, at least temporarily. A popular fringe tidbit suggests that some taverns had specific drinking games where patrons would compete to hold their breath for the longest, often with hilarious and messy consequences after too much ale. You can almost see it now, some poor soul turning purple. Amidst the swirling smoke and boisterous laughter, your attention is inevitably drawn to the true heart of the medieval tavern, the alewife. She is, in many ways, the undisputed monarch of this bustling domain. You spot her, moving with a practiced efficiency behind a sturdy wooden counter, her movements a blur of activity. Her face, often ruddy from the heat of the fire and the constant exertion, might be stern, or perhaps surprisingly jovial, but always commanding. This isn't just some server, she's the brewer, the manager, the bouncer, and often the confidant for her patrons. The alewife is absolutely crucial to the tavern's existence. Unlike modern pubs where beer arrives in kegs from a factory in the medieval period, the ale was brewed on site, usually daily. This wasn't a casual hobby. It was a serious business, requiring skill, strength, and a deep understanding of fermentation. Imagine the sheer physical labor involved. hauling vast quantities of water, mashing grains, tending the fires, and then carefully monitoring the brewing process. It was an art form, passed down through generations, and the quality of a tavern's ale was its primary calling card. A poor brew meant no customers, and no customers meant no livelihood. You watch as she expertly scoops ale from a large wooden barrel, or perhaps a ceramic jug, into the waiting earthenware mugs. Her movements are quick and precise, a testament to countless hours spent pouring. She doesn't measure meticulously. It's an intuitive process, honed by experience. As she hands over a mug, there's often a brief exchange, quick word of greeting, terse instruction, or perhaps a weary sigh. She knows her regulars, their habits, and probably their life stories too. She's seen it all. Joy, despair, triumph, and countless drunken antics. The social standing of the alewife is a fascinating aspect of medieval life. While often a working-class figure, she held a position of considerable authority and respect within her community. She provided a vital service, and her establishment was a hub. Many alewives were independent businesswomen, a relatively rare status for women in the Middle Ages. They owned property, managed finances, and dealt with suppliers and customers. This made them surprisingly powerful figures in their local economies, often interacting with everyone from the lowliest peasant to the local lord steward. Historians still argue whether the prominence of female brewers was a sign of genuine economic opportunity for women, or simply a reflection of brewing being considered. Women's work within the household sphere extended to a commercial setting, a mainstream historical fact. Women were overwhelmingly responsible for brewing ale in medieval England, both for household consumption and commercial sale, leading to the term alewife. Quirky tidbit. Some alewives would use a brewing stick dipped in honey and passed around for patrons to lick, to sweeten the ale and signal its readiness. Imagine everyone taking a turn on the same stick. Hygienic, right? You can almost hear the faint clink of her ladle hitting the bottom of a barrel, a comforting sound of sustenance. And acts as a preservative. Weren't widely adopted in brewing until much later in the medieval period, and even then, their use spread slowly. So what you read drinking now is likely a far cry from your crisp IPA or your smooth stout. Instead of hops, medieval ale was often flavored with a mixture of herbs and spices known as grute. This blend could include anything from bog, myrtle, and heather to yarrow, ginger, or even pine needles. Imagine a subtle, earthy, sometimes slightly medicinal taste, quite different from the clean bitterness you're used to. Each brewer, and thus each tavern, would have had their own secret grute recipe, giving their ale a unique character. It was a bit like a medieval signature cocktail. This also means that the taste of ale could vary wildly from one village to the next, a delightful or dreadful surprise, depending on your luck. You can almost see the medieval equivalent of a craft ale enthusiast traveling far and wide, just to sample the local brews. The ale in that last village had too much yarrow, but this one has just the right hint of bog myrtle. The most important thing to remember about medieval ale, however, is its variability in strength and purpose. There wasn't just one type of ale. You'd have small beer or small ale, which was brewed from the second or third runnings of the mash, making it very low in alcohol, often less than 1%. This was the daily drink for everyone, including children. As it was often safer and more nutritious than the local water supply, imagine giving your kids a beer for breakfast. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about hydration and calories. Then there were the stronger brews, made from the first, richer runnings, reserved for adults and special occasions. These could range from 3 to 5% alcohol, similar to many modern session beers, but still far less potent than your average modern strong lager or wine. This constant low-level consumption of small beer meant that people likely maintained a constant mild buzz rather than getting overtly drunk. Though of course exceptions abounded, as you've already witnessed in the common room. The sheer volume consumed was staggering. Historical records suggest that individuals might drink several liters of small ale per day. It was literally their hydration. Historians still argue whether the consistent consumption of low-alcohol ale contributed to a generally more placid or more medieval populace. A quirky tidbit. To check the quality and sweetness of ale, some medieval ale tasters would pour it on a wooden bench and then sit on it. If their leather breeches stuck to the bench, the ale was good. Talk about a sticky job interview. So, as you take another theoretical sip from your earthenware mug, remember, you're not just drinking a beverage, you're participating in a crucial aspect of medieval daily life, a vital source of calories, hydration, and perhaps a little bit of liquid courage. With your mug of medieval ale in hand, your stomach begins to rumble. The pervasive aroma of simmering stew and baking bread has finally broken through the sensory assault of smoke and body odor. You look around and notice that, just like the ale, the food in the tavern is simple, hearty, and designed for sustenance, not culinary extravagance. Most medieval taverns wouldn't have offered a sprawling menu with multiple courses. Forget anything approaching modern gastropub fare. You're more likely to find a selection of staple items that are easy to prepare in bulk and designed to fill hungry bellies. The most common offering, almost universally available, would have been bread. Not the fluffy, airy stuff you get from a supermarket, but dense, coarse loaves, often made from rye, barley, or a mix of grains. This bread was the foundation of the medieval diet, serving as both food and often as a sort of edible plate, known as a trencher, upon which other foods would be placed. You might even see someone tear off a hunk of bread and use it to sop up the last vestiges of their meal, then perhaps eat the bread itself. Waste not, want not, particularly in the Middle Ages. Beyond bread, the most likely hot dish would be a stew or pottage, simmering continuously over the hearth in a large communal pot. This stew would be a medley of whatever ingredients were available and in season. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and onions, perhaps some dried peas or beans. And if you were lucky, a few scraps of meat. The meat would likely be tough, often salted or cured to preserve it, and not necessarily the prime cuts. Think a bit like a medieval mystery meat stew. Always a little different, always a bit of a gamble. This continuous cooking method meant that the flavors would meld over hours, sometimes even days, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. It was efficient, economical, and provided much-needed calories. You might even be offered a simple boiled egg or a piece of cheese if the tavern had a dairy supplier. There's no elaborate cutlery here. You'd likely be eating with your fingers, or perhaps using a simple spoon if provided. Shared plates or bowls were common, reinforcing the communal dining experience. It's a far cry from individual portions in pristine place settings. You might even see patrons dipping their bread directly into the communal stew pot, a practice that would probably get you some serious side-eye in a modern restaurant. But here, it's just how things are done. One mainstream historical fact is that meat was generally less common in the diet of the average medieval peasant, and often reserved for special occasions or the wealthy, so tavern stews might feature more vegetables and legumes. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval cooks believed that adding certain herbs to their stew could ward off evil spirits, effectively turning dinner into a protective charm. Historians still argue whether the dietary choices available in taverns genuinely reflected the average person's daily diet, or offered a slightly richer, more varied experience due to their commercial nature. Either way, it filled you up, and that was the main goal. As you finish your hearty, if somewhat unrefined, meal, a less pleasant reality of the medieval tavern, and indeed, medieval life in general, begins to assert itself. The distinct lack of modern hygiene. This isn't a place where you'll find sparkling clean surfaces or the fresh scent of disinfectant. Far from it. The air, already thick with smoke and various human odors, carries a subtle undertone of, well, let's just say earthiness is a polite term for it. You might notice the floor, which you've already observed is uneven, also seems to have a permanent sticky sheen from countless spills. Sawdust or rushes might be strewn about to absorb some of the mess, but they also offer a convenient hiding place for all manner of debris and, frankly, tiny creatures you'd rather not think about. Table surfaces, though perhaps wiped down occasionally, are unlikely to have ever met soap and hot water. The earthenware mugs, while rinsed, probably carried the ghost of many previous imbibers. Forget about hand sanitizer. Personal cleanliness was a much lower priority in a world where access to clean, Warm water was a luxury, and understanding of germ theory was centuries away. People themselves contributed to the general aroma. Daily bathing as we know it was rare for most common folk. While medieval people weren't necessarily dirty by their own standards, their methods of cleaning involved rubbing down with cloths, using herbal rinses, perhaps an annual full-body bath if they were particularly fastidious or had access to a bathhouse. Clothes were wool or linen, often worn for extended periods between washes, and were more likely to be beaten free of dust than thoroughly laundered. So, the combined scent of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and wood smoke created a very unique and pervasive olfactory experience. It's the kind of scent that would cling to your modern clothes for days, even after a good airing out. Consider the facilities, too. Proper privy or latrine would be a luxury, and often a simple, shared chamber pot or an outdoor pit would suffice, probably located at the very edge of the tavern's property, and definitely not plumbed. The concept of flushing toilets wouldn't arrive for many more centuries. So, when nature called, your options were rustic, to say the least. It's no wonder that medieval towns, generally, were not known for their pleasant aromas. You might encounter an open ditch running alongside the street outside, serving as a convenient, albeit foul-smelling, drain for household waste. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval towns and public places often suffered from poor sanitation, contributing to the rapid spread of diseases like the plague. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval texts suggest using ashes or sand as a sort of dry shampoo for hair, hinting at alternative methods for staying somewhat clean. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly unaware of the link between filth and disease, or if their practical limitations simply made widespread cleanliness impossible. You probably wouldn't want to bring your white gloves into this place, even if you owned any. Despite the pervasive smells and questionable cleanliness, the medieval tavern was far from a somber place. Indeed, it was a hub of entertainment and recreation, offering a much-needed respite from the arduous realities of daily life. As you sit there, you begin to pick up on the various forms of amusement unfolding around you. One of the most common pastimes, almost universally present, involved games of chance. You can easily spot groups gathered around tables, their faces illuminated by candlelight, intently focused on throws of dice. Gambling was rampant in the Middle Ages, and taverns were prime locations for it. Fortunes, however meager, could be won or lost in a single roll. You might hear the excited shouts of winners and the frustrated groans of losers as they tossed their crudely carved dice, often made of bone or wood. Cheating, of course, was probably as common as honest play, leading to heated arguments that occasionally escalated into the very brawls we'll touch on later. It's a classic human trait, isn't it? The hope of quick riches, even when the odds are stacked against you. Besides dice, other simple games, perhaps involving sticks or stones, might also be played, requiring a keen eye or a bit of cunning. Beyond the click and clatter of dice, the tavern often buzzed with music and storytelling. If you were lucky, a wandering minstrel might pass through, offering to play a few tunes on a lute, a pipe, or a simple drum in exchange for a few coins or a free mug of ale. Imagine the lively, often melancholic melodies filling the smoky air, transporting listeners, however briefly, from their mundane concerns. These minstrels were the medieval equivalent of touring musicians, bringing news, ballads, and entertainment from town to town. Their repertoire would include heroic tales, romantic laments, and certainly a good many bawdy songs that would make your grandmother blush. And even without a professional minstrel, patrons themselves would often break into song, perhaps a folk tune, a drinking song, or a hymn, their voices blending in a spontaneous, if not always harmonious, chorus. Storytelling was another major draw. In a world without books for the common person, and certainly no internet or television, oral tradition was paramount. Travelers would share tales of their journeys. Merchants would recount news from distant markets, and locals would spin yarns about legendary figures or recent events. These stories, embellished with each retelling, provided both entertainment and a vital means of information exchange. You might lean in, trying to catch the hushed tones of a thrilling adventure, or a ghost story told in the flickering shadows. It's easy to see how gossip spread like wildfire in such an environment. One mainstream historical fact is that card games, though less common than dice early in the medieval period, gradually gained popularity in taverns as they were introduced and spread across Europe. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval taverns had puzzle jugs designed to spill ale on the drinker, if not held and consumed in a very specific, often counterintuitive way, much to the amusement of onlookers. Historians still argue whether the primary draw of tavern entertainment was the specific activities offered, or simply the communal atmosphere and escape from the drudgery of daily life. Either way, it was a much-needed break. The lively atmosphere of the medieval tavern, while generally convivial, was also a fertile ground for conflict. All that ale, the close quarters, the gambling, and the simmering resentments of daily life could, and often did, erupt into brawls and disorder. You might have been enjoying a quiet moment, only for the sudden crash of a mug, a raised voice, or the scrape of a bench to signal that trouble was brewing. Imagine the scene. Two patrons, perhaps arguing over a dice game gone sour, or simply a perceived insult, their voices growing steadily louder. Others might try to mediate, or more likely, egg them on. The air crackles with tension, then a shove, a punch, and suddenly the common room becomes a chaotic swirl of flailing limbs, overturned tables, and shouts. It's a bit like a Wild West saloon, but with more wool and less impressive dental hygiene. The heavy wooden benches and tankards could quickly become impromptu weapons, adding to the general mayhem. The alewife, the queen of her domain, would often be the first line of defense against such outbreaks. She might wield a heavy broom or a rolling pin, shouting curses and threats, trying to restore order. Her authority was considerable, born of necessity and the sheer will to keep her business running. Sometimes her intervention was enough to quell the disturbance. Other times, she might need the help of stronger patrons, or even resort to throwing the combatants out into the cold, muddy street. You'd think they'd learn, but the allure of warm ale and company was strong. These brawls weren't always serious. Sometimes they were drunken scuffles, ending with apologies. But they could also turn nasty, resulting in serious injuries, or even on rare occasions death. With no formalized police force as we understand it, and the local watch often being overwhelmed or simply uninterested in tavern squabbles, the consequences of such fights could be unpredictable. Justice, if it came, might be swift and brutal, meted out by angry locals, or it might be delayed and subject to the whims of the local lord or his representative. One mainstream historical fact, fighting and public disorder were common occurrences in medieval towns and taverns, being centers of social gathering and alcohol consumption, were frequent sites for such incidents. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval legal records show instances where patrons, after causing a brawl, were forced to pay for all the ale spilled during the fracas, a surprisingly practical form of punishment. Historians still argue whether the level of violence in medieval taverns was a reflection of inherently more aggressive societal norms, or simply a consequence of limited entertainment options and widespread access to alcohol. You can almost feel the tension in the air just before things kick off. As the evening wears on in the medieval tavern, and the last slurred songs fade into contented murmurs, you start to consider where you'll lay your head for the night. This isn't a modern hotel with individual rooms and plush beds. Sleeping arrangements in a medieval tavern were an exercise in communal living, often bordering on the utterly bewildering for a modern sensibility. Your first clue that things are different here is the distinct lack of private bedrooms. Unless you are a truly wealthy merchant or a high-ranking noble, accustomed to significant privilege, the idea of a single room all to yourself simply isn't an option. Instead, you'll likely find that the common room itself transforms into a dormitory. Imagine trying to sleep amidst the lingering smells of stale ale and wood smoke, perhaps still hearing the soft snores or restless movements of dozens of strangers around you. The most common sleeping surface would have been straw pallets. These weren't exactly luxurious mattresses. Picture a thin layer of straw, perhaps covered with a simple linen sheet or blanket, laid directly on the floor. You'd gather your meager belongings, maybe a cloak for extra warmth, and find an unoccupied patch of floor to claim as your own. Privacy was non-existent. You'd be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with other patrons, travelers, merchants, laborers, perhaps even a few local ne'er-do-wells who had nowhere else to go. It's the ultimate shared Airbnb experience, except without the reviews or the option to cancel. Sometimes, if the tavern was a bit larger or catered to slightly more affluent guests, There might be a dedicated sleeping loft or a separate room with multiple beds, but even these would be communal. Think of a large chamber filled with several crude wooden bed frames, each possibly shared by 2 or more people. The concept of personal space, as we know it, was simply not a priority in a world where warmth and safety in numbers often trumped individual comfort. You might even find yourself sharing a bed with someone you've never met, a necessity in overcrowded inns, and a common enough practice to be noted without much fanfare in historical accounts. One mainstream historical fact is that bed sharing, even among strangers, was a common practice in medieval inns and taverns due to limited space and the desire to share warmth in unheated rooms. A quirky tidbit: some medieval medical texts actually recommended sleeping with strangers as a way to balance humors or provide natural warmth. An interesting spin on communal sleeping. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of shared sleeping arrangements contributed to higher rates of disease transmission, or was a practical adaptation to the colder climate and limited housing options. Regardless, you'd likely be dreaming of a soft, solitary bed, even if just for a moment. Even with the dubious sleeping arrangements and the ever-present aroma, the medieval tavern was far more than just a place to eat and drink. It was the ultimate social nexus of its time. In a world without widespread literacy, newspapers, or instant communication, the tavern served as the primary conduit for information, gossip, and the conducting of everyday business. Think about it. If you wanted to know what was happening in the next village, or if the king had issued a new decree, or even just whether the spring planting would be good this year, where would you go? Not to a website, certainly. You'd head to the tavern. Here, weary travelers fresh off the road would bring news from afar, sharing tales of highwaymen, political intrigue, or the latest saints' miracles. These oral reports, often exaggerated with each retelling, were the medieval equivalent of breaking news, spreading through the common room faster than a spilled mug of ale. Beyond grand pronouncements, the tavern was a hotbed of local gossip. Who was courting whom? Whose cow had strayed? Who was suspected of cheating at cards? Every whispered conversation, every knowing glance added to the intricate web of community knowledge. It was how reputations were made and broken, how social norms were reinforced, and how people kept tabs on their neighbors. You might hear a farmer complaining about his greedy landlord, or a craftsman boasting about a new commission, all contributing to the lively hum of communal life. It was, in essence, a medieval social media platform, but entirely face-to-face, and with considerably more immediate consequences for missteps. Crucially, taverns were also vital for business dealings. Merchants would meet to discuss prices, negotiate routes, and strike deals. Farmers might sell their produce directly to the alewife, or find buyers for their surplus goods. Apprentices might seek out masters, and laborers might find work for the day. While formal markets existed, the informal atmosphere of the tavern often facilitated agreements that might be more difficult in a structured setting. It was a place where handshakes sealed agreements, and a shared drink solidified trust, or occasionally revealed treachery. You can almost picture a shady deal being whispered in a dark corner, illuminated only by a flickering candle. One mainstream historical fact is that oral tradition and face-to-face communication were the dominant forms of information exchange in the Middle Ages, making gathering places like taverns essential. A quirky tidbit: some medieval records indicate that formal contracts, particularly for smaller transactions, were occasionally witnessed, and even signed within taverns, lending a certain informal legitimacy to the proceedings. Historians still argue whether the taverness role as a social and business hub fostered greater social cohesion, or simply provided a stage for existing tensions to play out. Either way, it was a central pillar of medieval community life. While ale was undoubtedly the undisputed king of medieval tavern beverages, it wasn't the only option available. As you settle deeper into the atmosphere, you might notice that some establishments, particularly the more upscale inns, or those in wealthier towns, offered a few other choices for the discerning medieval palate. These alternatives, however, were often more expensive, less common, and sometimes quite different from what you might expect. One of the oldest and most revered fermented drinks in Europe was mead. This ancient beverage, made from fermented honey and water, often with spices or fruits added for flavor, predates ale in many cultures. Mead held a somewhat mythical status, often associated with gods, heroes, and celebrations. In a medieval tavern, if available, mead would likely be a more expensive choice, perhaps reserved for special occasions or for those with more coin in their purse. Its sweetness and higher alcohol content would have made it a prized treat, a luxurious departure from the daily small beer. Imagine sipping something akin to a very strong, spiced honey wine, a taste that might transport you back to epic sagas and dragon-slaying tales. Then there was wine. While wine was certainly consumed in medieval Europe, its availability in a common tavern depended heavily on the region. In wine-producing areas, especially southern France, Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, wine would be far more common and accessible, perhaps even cheaper than ale. However, in regions like England, where vineyards were less prevalent or the climate less suitable, wine was often an imported luxury, making it a considerably more expensive and rarer commodity in your average village tavern. The wine itself would also be quite different from modern vintages. Without modern understanding of controlled fermentation or proper storage, medieval wine could be quite volatile. It might be sweet, sour, or even fortified with honey or spices to mask imperfections. Often, it would be diluted with water, not just for taste, but also to make it last longer or stretch a limited supply. So, don't expect a perfectly aged Bordeaux. You might get something closer to a robust rustic vinegar with a kick. Cider, made from fermented apples, would also be a regional specialty, particularly in areas with abundant apple orchards, like parts of England and France. It would be a seasonal drink, enjoyed when apples were ripe, offering a refreshing and often quite potent alternative to ale. And in some northern regions, dairy products like whey or buttermilk, sometimes fermented, might even be offered as thirst quenchers, though these were more utilitarian than celebratory. One mainstream historical fact is that wine was a luxury import for much of Northern Europe during the medieval period, making it significantly more expensive than locally brewed ale. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical texts prescribed certain types of wine as remedies for various ailments, suggesting that taverns sometimes doubled as impromptu pharmacies, at least for the well-to-do. Historians still argue whether the perceived quality of these non-ale beverages was genuinely superior, or if their rarity simply elevated their status and desirability among the medieval populace. You might opt for a taste of mead, just for the novelty, even if it sets you back a few extra pennies. Having explored the varied liquid refreshments of the medieval tavern, it's worth drawing a crucial distinction that might not be immediately obvious to your modern mind. The difference between a medieval tavern and a medieval inn, while they both served alcohol and provided a place for travelers, their primary functions and the services they offered could be quite distinct. You've experienced the tavern firsthand, a lively, often raucous common room, primarily focused on serving drinks and simple food, often to a local clientele. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of your neighborhood pub or bar. It's where people go for a quick pint, some gossip, and a communal meal. As you discovered, sleeping arrangements were rudimentary at best, often just a shared straw pallet on the floor of the common room. It was a place of informal gathering, a quick stop, rather than an extended stay. The emphasis was on the social hub and the drink itself. An inn, on the other hand, was a more comprehensive establishment, geared specifically towards accommodating travelers for longer stays. While it certainly served ale and food, its core business was providing lodging and stabling for horses. Imagine arriving at an inn after a long, arduous journey. You wouldn't just be looking for a quick drink, you'd need a place to rest your weary bones, securely shelter your horse, perhaps even conduct more significant business. Inns were often found along major trade routes or within larger towns, strategically placed to cater to the needs of merchants, pilgrims, and anyone else undertaking a longer journey. The layout of an inn would typically be more elaborate than a simple tavern. You'd often find a central courtyard where horses could be stabled and carriages parked securely. Around this courtyard there would be various buildings, the main house with its common room similar to a tavern, but usually larger and perhaps a bit more refined kitchens and crucially dedicated private or semi-private sleeping chambers upstairs or in separate wings. While still not luxurious by modern standards, you might still be sharing a room with other travelers, but perhaps in proper beds rather than just straw. They offered a higher degree of comfort and privacy than a mere tavern. The services at an inn would also extend beyond just food and drink. They might offer a laundry service, provide hot baths, or have a resident farrier to shoe horses. The staff would be larger, often including stable hands, cooks, and chambermaids, reflecting the broader range of services. The innkeeper, unlike the alewife who might only manage the brewing, was a true entrepreneur overseeing a complex operation. One mainstream historical fact: inns often provided separate stables for travelers' horses, a crucial service for medieval transport and security, which taverns typically lacked. A quirky tidbit: some inns offered a wake-up call service where a servant would pull on a rope tied to a guest's toe. Hanging out the window, historians still argue whether the distinction between a tavern and an inn was always clearly defined, or if many establishments blurred the lines, offering varying degrees of services. Regardless, if you needed a proper night's rest and a place for your steed, you'd be seeking out an inn. Given the sheer number and social importance of taverns, it's no surprise that medieval authorities, from local lords to town councils and even the church, felt the need to impose some form of regulation and licensing. You might imagine a free-for-all, but that wasn't entirely the case. While certainly less structured than modern licensing laws, there were attempts to control these bustling establishments. One of the primary motivations for regulation was, predictably, revenue. Taverns were profitable businesses, and rulers quickly realized they could generate significant income through taxes and fees. Licensing a tavern meant it could legally operate, and in return, the alewife or innkeeper would pay a fee to the local lord, the monarch, or the municipal government. This was a direct source of income that helped fund everything from local infrastructure to royal coffers. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of a business permit, a way for the powers that be to get their cut of the nightly revelry. You can almost hear a medieval tax collector making his rounds, a glint in his eye as he eyes the overflowing ale mugs. Beyond taxation, authorities were also concerned with maintaining order and public morality. As we've seen, taverns could be hotbeds of gambling, brawls, and other unruly behavior. Laws were often enacted to control opening and closing hours, to restrict certain types of gambling, or even to forbid the sale of ale during religious festivals or on Sundays. There were often attempts to curb excessive drunkenness, though, given the pervasive nature of ale consumption. These were often more aspirational than practical. The idea was to prevent taverns from becoming complete dens of iniquity, although they probably often skirted the line. The quality of the ale itself also came under scrutiny. Local officials, sometimes called ale conners, were appointed to taste and inspect the ale to ensure it met certain standards of strength and purity. This was important not just for consumer protection, but also because poor quality ale could lead to illness or public dissatisfaction, which could in turn lead to unrest. Imagine a town official, grim-faced, sampling a batch of ale and declaring it unfit for consumption, much to the dismay of the alewife and her thirsty patrons. This was a medieval form of quality control, ensuring that the tax-paying public wasn't being entirely shortchanged. One mainstream historical fact: English monarchs frequently imposed taxes on ale sales, making ale brewing and selling a significant source of royal revenue. A quirky tidbit: some medieval town ordinances decreed that if an ale cunner declared ale to be of poor quality, the offending alewife could be publicly shamed, sometimes by being made to stand in the stocks with the bad ale poured over her head. Talk about a bad Yelp review. Historians still argue whether these regulations were primarily effective in controlling behavior or merely served as a means for authorities to exert control and extract revenue from a popular pastime. Either way, even in the wild Middle Ages, there was always someone trying to bring a little order to the chaos. Despite the best efforts of medieval authorities to regulate and control them, taverns often harbored a shadier, more clandestine side. They were almost by their very nature havens for all sorts of individuals who preferred to operate outside the strictures of polite society or the watchful eyes of the law. You can almost feel this undercurrent as you scan the faces in the smoky gloom, a glint in someone's eye, a furtive whisper in a corner. This reputation meant that taverns were frequently associated with crime. They provided anonymity, a place where strangers could meet without drawing undue attention, and where illicit deals could be struck under the guise of casual revelry. Imagine a highwayman planning his next ambush, a thief selling stolen goods, or perhaps even a conspirator hatching a plot against the local lord. The noise and confusion of a busy common room were perfect cover for such activities. It's not hard to picture a shadowy figure slipping a pouch of coins to another quickly and without drawing a glance. Beyond the more serious offenses, taverns were also breeding grounds for petty crime. Pickpockets would ply their trade, expertly relieving drunken patrons of their meager coin purses. Cheats at dice or card games would fleece unsuspecting travelers. Prostitution, though often officially condemned, was an undeniable presence in or around many taverns, offering another layer of illicit activity. The blurred lines between legitimate revelry and outright criminality were a constant challenge for medieval law enforcement. The very atmosphere of the tavern, with its late hours and ample alcohol, also contributed to its reputation. A drunk patron was an easy target, both for exploitation and for recruitment into less than savory schemes. You might overhear a rough-looking fellow trying to entice a naive newcomer into a game of chance where the odds are decidedly not in their favor. It was a place where caution was always advisable, and where trusting the wrong person could lead to anything from an empty purse to a much more dangerous predicament. One mainstream historical fact: medieval legal records frequently cite taverns as the locations where crimes were planned or executed, particularly theft and assault. A quirky tidbit: some medieval folklore suggested that devils and mischievous spirits were particularly fond of lurking in taverns, tempting patrons into sin and petty crimes, a convenient scapegoat for bad behavior. Historians still argue whether the high incidence of crime associated with taverns was due to their inherent nature as gathering places, or if it was more a reflection of societal problems like poverty and lack of opportunity, forcing people into illicit activities, with taverns simply serving as convenient meeting points. Regardless, if you were a law-abiding citizen with valuables, you'd probably keep your guard up in a medieval tavern. With all the drinking, gambling, and occasional brawling, it's perhaps no surprise that the medieval tavern often found itself at odds with the most powerful institution of the age, the church. You might think that in such a devout era, public houses would be universally condemned. But the reality was far more nuanced and frankly a bit contradictory. On one hand, the church certainly preached against the sins associated with excessive drinking and revelry. Drunkenness was seen as a gateway to other vices: lust, gluttony, sloth, and rage. Sermons would often thunder against those who spent their days squandering their meager earnings in taverns, neglecting their families and their spiritual duties. Monks and priests would decry the moral decay they believed the taverns fostered, painting them as dens of iniquity where the devil did his best work. You can almost hear a stern friar railing against the den of iniquity down the street, while secretly longing for a pint himself.
However,
on the other hand, the relationship was more complex. The church itself consumed a vast amount of ale and wine. Monasteries were often major brewers and vintners, producing both for their own consumption and for sale. In some cases, the church even owned or operated taverns, or benefited directly from the taxes on them. This created a rather awkward paradox, condemning the vice while profiting from its source. It was a bit like a modern government taxing cigarettes, while simultaneously running anti-smoking campaigns. Furthermore, taverns often served a practical purpose that even the church couldn't ignore. They provided lodging for pilgrims, a place for common folk to gather after church services, and even, at times, served as makeshift parish halls for secular gatherings. Some churches even had church ales, or wakes where ale was brewed and sold to raise funds for the church, essentially turning the churchyard into a temporary tavern. This blurred the lines considerably. So, while the rhetoric was often one of condemnation, the practical realities of medieval life meant a degree of uneasy coexistence. One mainstream historical fact is that church councils and religious leaders frequently issued condemnations against drunkenness and tavern-going, particularly on holy days. Quirky tidbit: in some medieval morality plays, the tavern was explicitly depicted as a place where the devil would tempt souls, often featuring comical or frightening demonic characters lurking amidst the drinkers. Historians still argue whether the church's condemnation of taverns was genuinely aimed at moral reform, or if it was also a way to assert social control over popular lay gatherings that existed outside of direct ecclesiastical supervision. It's a classic example of do as I say, not as I do, played out on a grand medieval scale. You've already noticed the prominent role of the alewife. But her presence also hints at a broader, fascinating aspect of medieval taverns. The varied roles and perceptions of women in the tavern sphere. This wasn't exclusively a man's world, though male patrons certainly dominated the common room. As discussed, the alewife was often the central figure. A businesswoman who not only managed the establishment, but often brewed the ale herself. This gave her a degree of economic independence and authority that was unusual for women in medieval society. She was a respected, if sometimes feared, figure in the community, responsible for a vital service and often handling large sums of money. Her ability to keep order, manage staff, and maintain a reputation for good ale was crucial to her success. She was the medieval equivalent of a savvy entrepreneur navigating a competitive market. Beyond the alewife, other women would also be present. You might see serving women assisting the alewife, carrying mugs, cleaning tables, and generally helping with the busy demands of the tavern. These women were often working for wages, a crucial source of income for many unmarried or widowed women. Their interactions with patrons could be complex, ranging from polite service to playful banter, and occasionally to more illicit arrangements. And then there were the female patrons themselves. While perhaps not as numerous as men, women certainly frequented taverns. They might be local housewives meeting to socialize, discuss village news, or simply escape the confines of their homes. Traveling women, such as merchants, wives, pilgrims, or even independent traders, would also seek refreshment and lodging. It wasn't exclusively a male domain for leisure. However, the presence of women in a public drinking establishment did carry certain societal perceptions. For some, a woman in a tavern, especially if unaccompanied or if she lingered late, might be viewed with suspicion, her reputation questioned. Taverns, despite their communal nature, could be seen as places where moral boundaries were blurred. This created a dual standard. Men were expected to frequent taverns, but women doing so might be judged. Historians still argue whether the presence of women in medieval taverns was a sign of their increasing social freedom, or if it simply reflected their economic necessity to work or travel. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval sumptuary laws, designed to regulate clothing based on social status, occasionally included rules for tavern-goers, though these were more often aimed at discouraging ostentatious display than at controlling who could enter. One mainstream historical fact is that women in medieval towns were often involved in various trades, including brewing and selling foodstuffs, which naturally extended to running taverns. So, while you might see plenty of rough-and-tumble men, remember the often unseen but vital contributions of the women who kept these establishments running? The medieval tavern, in its traditional form, didn't last forever. Like all social institutions, it underwent significant changes over the centuries, eventually giving way to new models of public house. As you consider the vibrant, if grimy, scene you've experienced, you can start to discern the subtle forces that would lead to the decline of the quintessential medieval tavern. One major factor was the changing nature of brewing itself. As the medieval period progressed, and into the early modern era, the use of hops became increasingly widespread, particularly in Northern Europe. Hops provided a natural preservative, allowing ale to be brewed in larger quantities and stored for longer periods without spoiling. This innovation slowly shifted brewing from a daily, small-batch, localized process often done by alewives to a larger-scale, more commercial enterprise. Suddenly, a tavern didn't necessarily need to brew its own ale every day. It could purchase it from a larger, specialized brewery. This began to diminish the unique individual character of each tavern's brew, and consequently, the direct role of the alewife as brewer. Alongside this, there were shifts in population and economy. As towns grew larger and trade networks became more sophisticated, specialized establishments began to emerge. The distinction between inns and taverns became more pronounced, and new types of drinking establishments, like the alehouse, specifically focused on serving ale and less on food or lodging, started to take precedence. The very structure of urban life was evolving, leading to a more diversified landscape of public spaces. The rise of new social trends and even moral anxieties also played a part. As Protestantism gained traction in some parts of Europe, there was often a renewed emphasis on sobriety and industriousness, leading to stricter regulations on public houses. While not a sudden death knell, these changing attitudes certainly contributed to a more regulated and perhaps less spontaneous tavern culture. The raw, unfiltered conviviality of the medieval common room slowly started to be replaced by something a bit more controlled. Finally, the very success of the tavern led to its evolution. As people became accustomed to public gathering places, the demand for more specialized services grew. If you wanted a good meal, you might go to an eating house. If you needed a long stay, you'd seek an inn. The simple, all-in-one medieval tavern gradually morphed or was replaced by these more specialized venues. One mainstream historical fact is that the widespread adoption of hops and brewing during the late medieval and early modern periods significantly altered the production and consumption of alcoholic wet beverages, leading to the rise of what we now call beer. A quirky tidbit. Some historians believe the increasing size of brewing vats directly contributed to the decline of individual alewives, as the sheer scale required more capital and male labor. Historians still argue whether the decline of the traditional medieval tavern was primarily an economic shift driven by new brewing techniques, or a social one driven by changing urban demographics and moral attitudes. You can almost feel the air in the common room subtly changing, a hint of the future creeping in. So, the classic medieval tavern with its smoky common room and daily brewed ale didn't vanish entirely. It simply transformed, evolving into the public houses and drinking establishments that would dominate later centuries. This transition from tavern to pub is a fascinating journey, reflecting broader societal changes. As hops became universal and brewing industrialized, the emphasis shifted from the tavern as a brewing center to the tavern as a place that served commercially produced ale or beer. The alewife, once the brewer herself, increasingly became a publican, managing the sale of beverages supplied by others. This marked a significant change in the role and autonomy of many women in the industry, as brewing became more of a large-scale, male-dominated profession. The term public house itself began to gain currency in England from the 17th century onwards, reflecting a more formalized and distinct type of establishment. These pubs often retained the communal spirit of their medieval ancestors, but were typically more regulated. It's often more specialized, and sometimes even a bit more refined. You might start to see separate rooms emerging, a public bar for the common folk, parlor for more genteel customers, and perhaps even a private room for meetings. This signaled a gradual move away from the single, chaotic common room of the medieval tavern towards a more segmented and class-conscious drinking environment. The architecture changed too. While medieval taverns were often simple, domestic structures adapted for public use. Later, pubs began to be purpose-built, often with more robust construction. Larger cellars for storing commercially brewed beer and more elaborate signage. The iconic hanging sign, often depicting a whimsical animal or a coat of arms, became a familiar sight, replacing the humble bush or branch that once signaled ale here. Imagine a medieval patron returning centuries later, bewildered by the sheer variety of signs and the lack of a prominent hearth. Pubs also continued to serve as social hubs, but their functions diversified further. They became places for political meetings, reading newspapers, and joining clubs or societies. The simple games of dice might give way to more complex card games, or even billiards, as entertainment options expanded. The emphasis, while still on drink and camaraderie, broadened to encompass a wider range of social activities. One mainstream historical fact is that the standardization of beer brewing with hops paved the way for larger breweries and a more consistent product, fundamentally altering the economics of public houses. A quirky tidbit: during the English Civil War, many pubs became clandestine meeting places for royalists and parliamentarians alike, often using secret knocks or codes to identify fellow sympathizers. Historians still argue whether the evolution from medieval tavern to modern pub represents a continuous cultural tradition or a series of distinct adaptations to changing social and economic conditions. Regardless, the spirit of community and conviviality, however evolved, continues to echo through their doors. Now that we've thoroughly explored the medieval tavern, from its smoky common room to its evolution into the modern pub, let's step outside its welcoming, if pungent, doors and cast our gaze wider. The medieval world was, of course, far more than just its drinking establishments. It was a landscape dotted with a fascinating array of buildings, each with its own purpose, character, and stories to tell. So, let's leave the clatter of tankards behind for a moment and consider some of these other ubiquitous structures that define daily life for most medieval people. Imagine yourself walking along a dirt track, perhaps leading from your small wattle-and-daub hut. You've seen the tavern, of course, but what else would dominate the skyline? Perhaps a distant, imposing stone structure on a hill, or the familiar spire of a local church. These buildings weren't just functional, they were symbolic, reflecting the power structures, beliefs, and daily routines of medieval society. They represented the anchors of a community, the places where lives were shaped, protected, and often rigidly controlled. Think about the materials used. It's unlike our modern world of steel and concrete. Medieval construction relied heavily on what was locally available. Timber was paramount, forming the skeletons of houses, taverns, and even some smaller churches. Where stone was plentiful, such as in areas with quarries, it would be used for more significant. Permanent structures like castles and cathedrals, or the foundations of sturdier homes. Wattle and daub was common for walls, providing insulation for smaller dwellings. Thatch, bundles of dried reeds or straw, was the most common roofing material, giving many medieval villages a soft, undulating skyline. These choices weren't just aesthetic, they were practical, driven by necessity and the limitations of transport and technology. You wouldn't see endless rows of identical houses. Each building, even a simple peasant dwelling, would have its own unique character, shaped by the hands that built it and the resources at hand. The sheer physical effort required to construct these buildings, often without advanced tools or machinery, is astounding to consider. Every beam cut, every stone hauled, every handful of daub mixed represented hours of back-breaking labor. It's easy to take modern construction for granted, but in the Middle Ages, building anything significant was a monumental undertaking. It's often requiring the collective effort of an entire village or even a region. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval architecture was heavily influenced by locally available natural resources, leading to distinct regional building styles across Europe. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval carpenters believed that placing an old shoe or a dried animal bone in the foundations of a new house would bring good luck and ward off evil spirits. Historians still argue whether the apparent uniformity in some medieval village layouts was due to practical necessity, communal planning, or the dictates of a lord. Regardless, each structure played its part in the intricate tapestry of medieval life. Stepping further beyond the tavern, your gaze is inevitably drawn to the most imposing domestic structure in the landscape, the manor house. This wasn't just a large home, it was the administrative, economic, and social heart of a medieval village or estate, a clear symbol of power and authority in the feudal system. You'd see it, perhaps slightly elevated, commanding a view over the surrounding fields and peasant dwellings. The manor house was the residence of the local lord, whether he was a knight, a lesser noble, or a substantial landowner. It might not be a grand castle, but it was certainly far more substantial than any peasant's dwelling, a clear indicator of status. Imagine a complex of buildings, often enclosed within a defensive wall or ditch, perhaps even with a rudimentary tower for defense. It wasn't just one building, but a collection that might include stables, barns, a bakehouse, and even a small chapel. The core of the manor house was the Great Hall. This large open space served multiple purposes. It was the Lord's dining room, his audience chamber for dispensing justice, and often a communal sleeping area for his retainers and servants. Imagine a vast room, perhaps with a high, open timber roof, a central hearth filling the space with smoke, and long tables where everyone from the lord to his lowest servant might eat, albeit at different ends of the social spectrum. It was a bustling, often noisy space, constantly active. The lord and his immediate family might have a more private chamber, known as a solar, which offered a rare luxury, a degree of privacy and warmth away from the bustling hall. Life within the manor house revolved around the agricultural seasons and the obligations of feudalism. The lord managed his lands, collected rents, and administered justice among his tenants. You'd see peasants coming and going, bringing their dues, seeking arbitration for disputes, performing their required labor service. It was a constant hub of activity, underscoring the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. The lord's word was law, and the manor house was where that law was visibly enforced. One mainstream historical fact is that the manorial system was the dominant form of economic and social organization in much of medieval Western Europe, with the manor house at its center. A quirky tidbit: some manor houses had squint holes or peeping holes, through which the lord could observe his servants in the great hall from his private chambers without being seen himself. Historians still argue whether the relationship between the lord of the manor and his peasants was primarily exploitative, or if it offered a necessary degree of protection and stability in a dangerous world. Either way, the manor house stood as a constant reminder of who was in charge. Leaving the lord's domain behind, your gaze would inevitably fall upon another towering presence, the spiritual anchor of the community, the village church. This building, often the largest and most ornate structure in a rural settlement, was far more than just a place of worship. It was the absolute spiritual and very often social core of medieval life. Imagine approaching it. Even in a small village, the church would likely be built of stone, signifying its permanence and importance. Unlike the more humble timber and thatched dwellings, its spire or tower would be the highest point for miles around, a constant visible reminder of God's presence and the church's authority. The bells, when they rang, would mark the passage of time, summoning people to prayer, signaling events, or even warning of danger. Their sound would be an ever-present backdrop to daily life. Inside, the church would be a symphony of sights, sounds, and smells. Though often dim, lit by flickering candles and sunlight streaming through small, perhaps stained glass windows, the interior would be vibrant. Murals on the walls would depict biblical stories for a largely illiterate population, serving as a visual catechism. The smell of old incense, beeswax, and damp stone would permeate the air. You'd hear the murmuring of prayers, the solemn intonation of the priest, and perhaps the occasional cry of a baby during a service. The church dictated the rhythms of medieval life. Not only were Sundays and holy days dedicated to worship, but the church's calendar structured the entire year, from planting to harvest, from feast days to fasting periods, births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. All the major milestones of a person's life occurred within the confines or under the spiritual oversight of the local church. It was where your soul was cared for, where you sought solace, and where you faced judgment. Beyond its spiritual role, the church also served as a crucial community hub. It was often the only building large enough to host communal gatherings, even secular ones. Town meetings might be held in the churchyard, legal disputes might be settled at the church door, and markets sometimes even took place in the church square. In times of crisis like invasion or plague, the church might serve as a temporary refuge or hospital. It was a true center, a place where everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord, theoretically stood equal before God. Historians still argue whether the church's pervasive influence was primarily a force for social cohesion and moral guidance, or a tool for control and suppression of individual thought. One mainstream historical fact is that the parish church was the center of social and spiritual life for the vast majority of medieval Europeans, providing continuity and community. A quirky tidbit: some medieval churches had leper squints, small openings in the walls that allowed people with infectious diseases to observe services without entering the main congregation. It truly was a building for everyone, even if some had to watch from a distance. From the quiet contemplation of the church, you might next be drawn by the clang of metal and the smell of sulfurous smoke. This leads you to another essential structure in any medieval community, the blacksmith's forge. This wasn't just a workshop. It was a place of elemental power, where raw materials were transformed by fire and hammer, creating the very tools that underpin medieval existence. Imagine approaching the forge. Even from a distance, you'd hear the rhythmic clankling of hammer on anvil, sound that would carry through the village, a constant backdrop to daily life. As you get closer, the air grows thick with the smell of coal smoke, hot iron, and perhaps the faint tang of horses. As the blacksmith often doubled as a farrier, stepping inside or merely peering into the open doorway would be an assault on your senses. The heart of the forge is, of course, the hearth, a glowing, infernal pit where bellows pump air, superheating coal, to temperatures high enough to make iron malleable. The air would shimmer with heat, even on a cold day. See the blacksmith, his face grimy with soot and sweat, his muscles rippling as he expertly manipulates glowing pieces of metal with long tongs. Sparks would fly with every strike of his hammer, showering the workspace like tiny, fleeting stars. It's a dangerous, physically demanding job requiring immense strength, precision, and intuitive understanding of the properties of metal. The blacksmith was indispensable to any medieval community. He was the local engineer, the repairman, and the armorer, all rolled into one. Farmers relied on him to forge and repair their plowshares, scythes, and other agricultural tools. Carpenters needed his nails, hinges, and fittings. Housewives depended on him for pot hooks, cooking implements, and door latches. He would make the very chains that might secure a gate, or the simple locks that protected a chest. And of course, he was crucial for the local lord. In any knights, forging and repairing weapons, swords, arrowheads, spear tips, and fitting horses with essential iron shoes. Without the blacksmith, the fundamental tasks of farming, building, and defending would grind to a halt. His skill was often seen as almost magical, transforming hard, unyielding metal into useful objects with fire and brute force. This aura of power and mystery sometimes led to blacksmiths being associated with folklore and even superstition. You might hear whispers of them being able to charm iron or ward off evil with their craft. One mainstream historical fact is that iron tools and implements were fundamental to medieval agriculture, warfare, and daily life, making the blacksmith an indispensable craftsman. A quirky tidbit. Some medieval blacksmiths would keep a bucket of urine near their forge, believing it added strength to the metal when quenched. Though the science was certainly lacking, historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths developed their skills, primarily through formal apprenticeships or through a more informal generational passing down of knowledge. Regardless, his heavy hammer was a constant rhythm of survival. Moving from the fiery realm of the blacksmith, you'd eventually encounter another vital structure. It's often situated by a flowing body of water, the miller's water wheel, and its accompanying mill. This was the place where the very staff of life bread was made possible, transforming raw grain into flour. Imagine the gentle, rhythmic creak and splash of the water wheel, a sound that would have been as familiar to medieval ears as traffic noise is to ours. The mill itself would be a sturdy building, often made of stone or heavy timber, designed to house the massive machinery within. It might be powered by a river, a stream, or even a specially constructed mill pond, channeling water to turn the huge wooden wheel. This harnessing of natural power was a remarkable feat of medieval engineering, a testament to ingenuity in an era without electricity or complex engines. Inside the mill, it would be a dusty, noisy environment. The air would be thick with the fine powder of flour, coating every surface. The rhythmic clunk-clunk of the grinding stones, turning slowly but powerfully, would fill the space. Punctuated by the rustle of grain being fed into the hopper, the miller, often covered head to toe in white dust, would be a busy figure, constantly monitoring the flow of grain and the quality of the flour. He was a crucial intermediary between the farmer and the baker, or indeed the household that would bake its own bread. The miller held a unique and often contentious position in medieval society. He was, in essence, a monopolist. Peasants were often legally required to bring their grain to the lord's mill, to be ground. The miller would take a portion of the grain as his payment, known as the miller's toll. While this was a legitimate fee, millers were frequently accused of cheating, taking more than their fair share, or adding impurities to the flour, the stereotype of the dishonest miller. A character found in medieval literature like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales reflects this popular suspicion. He was a necessary evil, perhaps, but one to be watched. This fundamental process, the grinding of grain, was utterly essential for daily sustenance. Without flour, there was no bread, and without bread, mass starvation was a real threat. The mill was therefore not just an economic center, but a bottleneck in the food supply chain, giving the miller immense power within the local economy. A mainstream historical fact is that watermills were critical technological advancements in the Middle Ages, enabling the efficient production of flour on a larger scale than manual grinding. Quirky tidbit. To prevent theft or tampering, some medieval mills had intricate locking mechanisms, or even mill dogs specifically trained to guard the grain. Historians still argue whether the complaints against millers were primarily due to genuine widespread dishonesty, or simply the resentment felt by peasants towards any figure who extracted a portion of their hard-earned produce. Either way, the slow rumble of the mill was the sound of daily bread being prepared. From the rhythmic drone of the mill, you'd eventually find yourself drawn to the most dynamic and colorful hub of medieval commerce and social interaction, the market square. This open space, typically found at the heart of a town or a larger village, was where the pulse of daily life truly beat, a vibrant testament to the local economy and community spirit. Imagine stepping into the market square on a designated market day. Air would be alive with sound. The shouts of vendors hawking their wares, the bleating of livestock, the haggling over prices, and the general cacophony of hundreds of people conducting business and socializing. The smells would be a rich tapestry. Fresh bread, spices, unwashed wool, manure, and perhaps the faint aroma of roasting meat from a street vendor. This wasn't a pristine shopping mall. It was a sensory explosion, vibrant and unfiltered. The square would be packed with temporary stalls, wooden tables, and blankets spread on the ground, laden with every imaginable commodity. Farmers would bring their surplus produce, sacks of grain, fresh vegetables, eggs, cheese, and perhaps a few chickens or a piglet. Craftsmen would display their handmade goods, pottery, woven cloth, leather goods, simple tools, and carved wooden items. Merchants from further afield might offer more exotic wares, a bolt of fine linen, a rare spice from the east, or a small piece of glittering jewelry, drawing curious crowds. It was a place of endless possibility, where you could buy, sell, or simply marvel at the abundance. Haggling was not just expected, it was an integral part of the transaction. You wouldn't just pay a fixed price, you'd engage in a dance of negotiation, each party trying to get the best deal. This required wit, patience, and a keen eye for value. It was a social ritual as much as a commercial one, often accompanied by lively banter and good-natured debate. Imagine the satisfaction of securing a good price on a bundle of carrots. Knowing you'd outmaneuvered the vendor just a little, beyond commerce, the market square was also a crucial social space. It was where news spread rapidly, where friends met, and where strangers might eye each other with suspicion or curiosity. Public announcements, proclamations from the lord or king, and even public punishments would take place here, making it a focal point for civic life. It was the medieval town's main stage, where everyone played a part. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval markets were strictly regulated by local authorities to ensure fair weights, measures, and prices, and to collect taxes. A quirky tidbit: some medieval market squares had specific ducking stools used to punish dishonest bakers or brewers by dunking them in a pond, much to the amusement of the crowd. Historians still argue whether medieval markets were truly free in an economic sense, or if their functions were heavily constrained by feudal obligations and guild monopolies. Regardless, the market square was the beating heart of medieval urban life, full of hustle and bustle. Moving from the vibrant, earthly bustle of the market square, your imagination next turns to the most iconic and formidable structure of the medieval age, the castle. These weren't just grand residences, they were fortresses, symbols of power, centers of administration, and crucially, places of refuge in a tumultuous world. Imagine approaching a castle. Even from a distance, its sheer scale and defensive architecture would inspire awe and perhaps a healthy dose of fear. The thick stone walls, often impossibly high, would rise from the landscape, punctuated by battlements, turrets, and narrow arrow slits. A deep moat, perhaps filled with water or simply a dry ditch, might surround it, further isolating it from potential attackers. The only way in would be across a drawbridge leading to a massive, often iron-studded gatehouse. Bristling with defensive measures like portcullises and murder holes, it's certainly not a place you'd just waltz into for a casual visit. Life within the castle walls, though seemingly grand, was often far from comfortable. While the lord and his immediate family might enjoy relatively more private chambers, the castle was designed primarily for defense, not luxury. Rooms could be damp, drafty, and dimly lit. Heating came from open hearths, and sanitation was rudimentary, often involving garderobes that, let's be honest, probably smelled dreadful. Forget soft furnishings. The emphasis was on durability and practicality. You'd likely be sleeping on a hard wooden bed, and privacy, even for the lord, was often limited. The castle functioned as a self-sufficient miniature world, a constant hum of activity. There would be a large keep or tower, the strongest point of the castle, serving as a final refuge. Within the outer walls, you'd find a bustling bailey or courtyard, home to stables, workshops, kitchens, a chapel, and barracks for soldiers. It was a community in itself, constantly preparing for siege or conflict, even in times of peace. Soldiers would train, servants would cook and clean, and administrators would manage the lord's lands and wealth. The rhythms of castle life were dictated by military drills, administrative duties, and the constant need for vigilance. The lord's court would be a center of political intrigue, feasting, and entertainment, but always with an undercurrent of potential danger. The castle was a physical manifestation of feudal power, providing protection for those loyal to the lord and serving as a deterrent to rivals. One mainstream historical fact is that castles evolved from simple Maton-Bailey structures to complex stone fortifications over the course of the Middle Ages, reflecting advancements in siege warfare. A quirky tidbit: some castles had secret passages or tunnels, not just for escape, but also for launching surprise attacks on besiegers outside the walls. Historians still argue whether castles were primarily defensive strongholds or more about projecting the power and prestige of the ruling elite. Either way, their formidable presence dominated the medieval landscape. From the formidable walls of the castle, your journey through medieval structures takes you to a different kind of stronghold. One built not for earthly power, but for spiritual devotion, the monastery. These self-contained communities were islands of contemplation, scholarship, and often significant economic activity. Standing in stark contrast to the boisterous tavern or the lord's demanding manor, imagine approaching a monastery. It would often be set apart from the hustle and bustle of towns, nestled in a quiet valley or on a secluded hillside, deliberately chosen for its peaceful solitude. The buildings, typically stone, would be arranged around a central cloister, an open, square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways. This cloister was the heart of monastic life, a place for quiet reflection, reading, and exercise. The architecture, while often grand, emphasized austerity and functionality over ostentation, reflecting the monks' vows of poverty and simplicity. Life within the monastery was governed by a strict routine known as the divine office, a series of prayers and services performed at set hours throughout the day and night. The day would begin before dawn with matins and lauds, continue with other services like prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and conclude with compline at nightfall. This constant cycle of prayer, work, and study formed the backbone of monastic existence. Silence was often observed, particularly in the cloister and refectory, fostering an atmosphere of spiritual focus. But monasteries weren't just places of prayer. They were also centers of scholarship and learning in an age when literacy was rare outside the church. Monks would meticulously copy manuscripts by hand in the scriptorium, preserving ancient texts and producing new religious works. They maintained extensive libraries, becoming the custodians of knowledge during a period when much of Europe was in turmoil. Imagine the painstaking work of a monk, hunched over a desk by candlelight, carefully illuminating a precious text. Furthermore, monasteries were significant agricultural and economic entities. They often owned vast tracts of land farmed by lay brothers or peasant tenants. Monks were innovators in farming techniques, animal husbandry, and even brewing and winemaking. They produced goods for their own consumption and for sale, contributing significantly to the local economy. They also provided charity to the poor, cared for the sick, and offered hospitality to travelers, often serving as the medieval equivalent of roadside assistance. Historians still argue whether the wealth accumulated by some monasteries ultimately corrupted their spiritual mission or simply allowed them to fulfill their charitable and scholarly roles more effectively. One mainstream historical fact is that monasteries played a crucial role in preserving classical knowledge and fostering education throughout the early and high Middle Ages. A quirky tidbit: some monastic orders developed intricate systems of sign language to communicate during periods of strict silence, allowing them to function without speaking. This unique form of medieval communication truly made these places quiet sanctuaries of learning. Having glimpsed the disciplined quiet of the monastery, let's now turn to another crucial institution that shaped medieval urban life: the Guildhall. If the church was about spiritual community and the tavern about social release, the Guildhall was about professional solidarity, economic power, and mutual support, particularly for the rising class of artisans and merchants. Imagine a sturdy, often impressive building, usually located near the market square or in a bustling commercial district. Unlike the more rough and ready tavern, the Guildhall would convey a sense of gravitas and order. It was the physical embodiment of the guild, an organization of master craftsmen, merchants, or even specific trades in a town. These guilds were medieval equivalents of modern trade unions, professional associations, and even social clubs, all rolled into one. Inside, the guild hall would typically feature a large meeting room where members would gather. There might be a long table for formal discussions, benches for attendees, and perhaps an elevated seat for the guildmaster. The walls might be adorned with the coats of arms of prominent members or banners displaying the guild's insignia. It was a place of formal proceedings, where decisions about trade, prices, quality, and apprenticeships were made. You could almost feel the weight of tradition and collective bargaining in the air. The functions of the guild were extensive. Primarily, they regulated their specific trade. They set standards for quality and craftsmanship, ensuring that members produced goods of a certain caliber, a medieval form of consumer protection. They also controlled who could practice a trade, ensuring that only those who had completed a rigorous apprenticeship and proved their skill could become full members. This protected their markets and ensured high standards. Imagine the painstaking effort of an apprentice, knowing his future depended on the judgment of the guildmasters. Beyond economic regulation, guilds also provided a vital social safety net for their members. They acted as fraternal organizations, offering support in times of illness, old age, or death. They might provide loans, care for widows and orphans of members, and organize religious ceremonies and feasts. It was a powerful sense of brotherhood. In a harsh and uncertain world, guilds also played a significant role in civic life, participating in town government, organizing militias, and putting on elaborate religious pageants and festivals. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval guilds played a crucial role in regulating trade, training skilled labor, and providing social welfare for their members in towns. A quirky tidbit: some guild halls had a special swearing box, where new members would literally swear an oath of loyalty to the guild, sometimes containing a relic or sacred object to emphasize the seriousness of the vow. Historians still argue whether guilds primarily fostered economic innovation through quality control, or if they ultimately stifled it through restrictive monopolies. Either way, they were a powerful force in medieval urban development. We've journeyed through the medieval tavern, explored the Lord's manor, contemplated the church, felt the heat of the forge, heard the rumble of the mill, haggled in the market, stood in awe of the castle, and found quiet in the monastery and purpose in the guild hall. Now, let us tie it all together by stepping back and looking at the grand tapestry that is the medieval city itself, a vibrant, chaotic, and utterly mesmerizing ecosystem of human life. Imagine standing on a slight hill, looking down at a bustling medieval city. Unlike the sprawling, grid-like metropolises of today, a medieval city would be dense and contained, often encircled by formidable stone walls, a stark reminder of the ever-present threat of conflict. These walls weren't just for defense. They defined the city, separated its urban dwellers from the rural world outside, and controlled the flow of people and goods through impressive gatehouses. Within those walls, the city would be a bewildering maze of narrow, winding streets and alleyways. Forget straight lines and logical layouts. Medieval cities grew organically, their paths often following old footpaths, property lines, or the contours of the land. Houses, often timber-framed with upper stories overhanging the street, would be packed tightly together. Might even be able to shake hands with someone across the street from an upper window. The ground underfoot would be a mix of packed earth, cobbles, and whatever refuse had been tossed out. The air would be a potent mix of all the smells we've encountered. Would smoke from countless hearths, the aroma of baking bread and brewing ale. It's the tang of animal waste. It's the stench of inadequate sanitation, and the occasional whiff of a tannery or a butcher's shop. It was a city of constant noise. The clang of the blacksmith, the cries of street vendors, the chatter of merchants, the ringing of church bells, marking the hours and the general hum of thousands of lives being lived in close proximity. It was a constant sensory assault, a world away from the controlled environments we inhabit today. Every building we've discussed would be present, contributing to this vibrant chaos. The taverns would be overflowing, the market square a beehive of activity, churches would echo with prayers, and the imposing castle or guild hall would stand as testament to power and order. This density fostered a unique sense of community, but also bred disease and tension. Life was lived very publicly, with little privacy. Yet, for many, the city offered opportunities. Escape from feudal serfdom, the chance to learn a trade, and the allure of commerce and social mobility. It was a place where fortunes could be made, knowledge exchanged, and new ideas sparked. Even amidst the squalor and daily struggles, one mainstream historical fact is that medieval cities grew significantly in population and economic importance from the 11th century onwards, becoming centers of trade, craftsmanship, and governance. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cities employed official gong farmers who worked only at night, as their trade was considered too foul for daylight hours. A truly thankless job. Historians still argue whether the growth of medieval cities was primarily driven by economic factors like trade, or by social factors like the desire for freedom from feudal lords. Regardless, the medieval city was a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring need for community. It's time now to gently pull back from the sights and sounds of the medieval world, allowing the clamor of the city to fade into a distant hum, the chill of the night, the warmth of the ale, the earthy smells. Let them all dissolve like mist at dawn. You've journeyed through bustling taverns, stoic castles, the quiet contemplation of monasteries, glimpsing lives lived so differently from our own. As the last echoes of medieval life recede, feel the weight of history settle softly around you, a blanket of forgotten tales and ancient dreams. Let your own thoughts drift, like smoke from a distant hearth, until they, too, vanish into the stillness of the night. Leap now, and let the quiet come.